The storm hit Kepler 442b like an angry beast. Wind howled across the rocky landscape, carrying dust and debris that could strip paint from metal. Dr. Jake Morrison pressed himself against the wall of his research station as another gust shook the entire building. The power had gone out an hour ago. His backup generators were failing one by one. Jake stared at the warning lights flashing red on his control panel. Life support would last maybe 6 more hours if he was lucky. Jake was a xenobiologist from Earth. He had come to this remote planet to study the local wildlife. For 3 months, he had been living alone in his small research station, taking notes and collecting samples. It was supposed to be safe work. The planet was listed as uninhabited in all the official records, but Jake had seen signs that the records were wrong. Strange footprints in the mud, organized piles of rocks that looked too neat to be natural, tool marks on tree bark. Something intelligent lived on this world, something that wanted to stay hidden. Now, as his shelter fell apart around him, Jake wished he had reported his findings to Earth Command. But he had wanted to be sure first. Scientists who cried wolf about alien life usually found their careers ending quickly. Another crash of thunder made Jake jump. Through his small window, he could see nothing but swirling dust and rain. His weather sensors had died with the main power, but he guessed the storm would last at least 2 more days. His shelter would not. Jake grabbed his emergency pack and stuffed it with medical supplies, food bars, and his portable heater. His universal translator went into his pocket along with a small flashlight. Everything else would have to stay behind. The wind nearly knocked him down the moment he stepped outside. Jake pulled his hood tight and began walking toward the rocky hills he had mapped weeks ago. There were caves in those hills. He had seen them from his rover during his surveys. Caves meant shelter. The journey took 2 hours. Every step was a fight against the wind. Rain soaked through his jacket and chilled him to the bone. By the time Jake reached the hills, his hands were shaking from cold and exhaustion. The first cave he found was too shallow. Wind and rain still reached the back wall. The second was better but had loose rocks that looked ready to fall. The third cave looked perfect. It was deep and dry with smooth walls and a level floor. Jake stumbled inside and immediately felt relief. The howling wind became a distant whisper. He was safe. He pulled out his flashlight and looked around. The cave was bigger than he had expected. His light showed tunnels leading deeper into the hill. Someone or something had shaped these walls. They were too smooth to be natural. Jake set up his portable heater and sat down to rest. He opened a food bar and began to eat. The cave was surprisingly warm. Maybe the rock held heat from the day. That was when he heard the sound. It was soft and high-pitched, like a baby crying. Jake froze with the food bar halfway to his mouth. He listened carefully. There it was again, definitely crying. And it was coming from deeper in the cave. Jake stood up slowly. His hand found the translator in his pocket. Maybe this was his chance to finally make contact with the planet's intelligent life. Maybe they needed help. He followed the sound through a narrow tunnel. His flashlight beam danced on the walls as he walked. The crying got louder. There were multiple voices now, babies or cubs, something young and helpless. The tunnel opened into a large chamber. Jake's light swept across the space and he gasped. There were 6 small creatures huddled together in the center of the chamber. They looked like wolf puppies but were the size of human children. Their fur was matted and dull. Some were shivering. One was barely breathing. Jake forgot all about being careful. These were babies and they were sick. He took a step forward. A roar shook the cave. Jake spun around. His flashlight beam caught glowing yellow eyes. Lots of them. The creatures that owned those eyes stepped into the light and Jake's blood turned to ice. They stood 7 feet tall on their back legs. Their bodies were covered in thick gray fur. Their faces were like wolves, but intelligent. Their hands had long claws that gleamed in the flashlight beam. 8 of them formed a circle around Jake. There was no way out. The largest one stepped forward. Scars covered his face and arms. When he opened his mouth, Jake saw teeth like daggers. The creature spoke in a deep, growling language that sounded like controlled rage. Jake's translator beeped and displayed words on its small screen. "Who dares threaten our young?" Jake raised his hand slowly. "I am not a threat. I seek shelter from the storm. I did not know anyone lived here." The scarred leader snarled something else. The translator worked again. Lies, you came for the cubs. All outsiders come for the cubs. No, Jake said. I am a scientist. I study life. I do not harm the young. But the wolf creatures were not listening. They began to close in. Jake could smell their breath, could see the hate in their eyes. In their world, anyone who came near their babies was an enemy. And enemies died. Jake looked back at the sick cubs. Even facing death, he could not ignore their suffering. One of the smallest was making a terrible wheezing sound. They needed help. Your cubs are sick, Jake said. Let me help them. The leader roared and raised his claws. The other creatures tensed, ready to attack. Jake closed his eyes and waited for the end. But the attack did not come. A new voice spoke, older, female. The translator showed her words. Wait, Gorthak. Watch what he does. Jake opened his eyes. An older female had moved between him and the leader. Her fur was silver with age, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. If he moves toward the cubs to harm them, we kill him, she said. If he truly wishes to help, we learn something new about outsiders. The leader, Gorthak, growled low in his throat. But he stepped back. Jake was still surrounded, still one wrong move from death. But he had a chance, a very small chance. Jake slowly reached for his emergency pack. Several creatures snarled, but the old female held up a hand. Jake pulled out his medical kit and took a careful step toward the cubs. The sick ones needed help. And Jake was going to give it to them, even if it killed him. Jake knelt beside the smallest cub. The little creature was barely breathing. Its fur was cold and wet. Jake could hear fluid in its lungs with each wheeze. Without treatment, it would die within hours. The wolf creatures watched every move Jake made. Their claws were still out. Their muscles were still tensed for attack. But they did not stop him. Jake opened his medical kit carefully. His hands shook as he pulled out a small scanner. The device beeped softly as it analyzed the cub's condition. Pneumonia, severe dehydration, body temperature dangerously low. This one has lung sickness, Jake said to his translator. Water in the breathing passages. It needs medicine and warmth. Gorthak, the pack leader, growled something harsh. The translator showed his words. You speak lies to confuse us. Our cubs are strong. But the old female moved closer. Jake could see concern in her golden eyes as she looked at the sick cub. She understood that her grandchild was dying. Jake pulled out a small injector filled with broad-spectrum antibiotics. It was designed for human use, but the molecular structure should work on most carbon-based life forms. He hoped. I am going to give medicine, Jake announced. It will fight the sickness. Some of the warriors snarled and stepped forward. They thought he was going to poison their cub. Jake ignored them and pressed the injector against the cub's arm. There was a soft hiss as the medicine entered its bloodstream. Next, Jake activated his portable heater and placed it near the shivering cubs. The device hummed to life, casting warm orange light across the chamber. The cubs immediately began crawling toward the heat. Jake examined the other cubs one by one. 2 more had early signs of pneumonia. 3 were severely malnourished. All were cold and weak. As Jake worked, he began to understand why they were so sick. The chamber was a terrible place for young creatures to live. Water dripped from cracks in the ceiling, creating puddles on the floor. Cold air flowed in through gaps in the rock walls. There was no insulation, no proper ventilation, no drainage. The cubs were living in a damp, cold cave that was slowly killing them. Jake looked around the chamber with his engineer's eye. His father had been a construction worker back on Earth. Jake had spent summers learning to build things properly. This cave could be fixed. It would take work, but it could be made safe and warm. Your den has problems, Jake said to the old female. Water comes in. Cold air comes in. The young ones get sick because they cannot stay warm and dry. The female, who seemed to be named Shen according to the chatter Jake was hearing, tilted her head. You see problems with our ancestral cave? Yes, Jake said. But problems can be fixed. I can make this place better for the cubs. Gorthak roared something that made the other warriors step back. The translator worked furiously. No outsider touches our sacred cave. No outsider changes what our fathers built. But Shen was thinking. Jake could see the intelligence working behind her eyes. She was old enough to remember many cubs dying in this chamber, old enough to know that tradition was not always right. What changes would you make? She asked. Jake stood up slowly and pointed to the ceiling. Cover the cracks to stop water. Seal the air gaps to keep warmth in. Build channels to carry water away from where the cubs sleep. Create better airflow so they can breathe easily. Shen translated Jake's words into the growling language of her people. The other creatures listened with surprise. No outsider had ever offered to improve their home before. Most outsiders tried to destroy it. A younger warrior pushed forward. He was smaller than Gorthak but still impressive. His fur was darker, almost black. When he spoke, his voice was curious rather than angry. I am Nethys, the translator showed. I have seen outsider buildings. They do not leak like our cave. How do you know building secrets? Jake felt a spark of hope. At least one of them was willing to listen. My people have built shelters for thousands of years. We have learned from our mistakes. I can teach you what we have learned. Gorthak was not happy with this conversation. He barked orders at Nethys, who stepped back reluctantly. But Jake noticed that Nethys kept watching and listening. Jake returned to caring for the cubs. He gave antibiotics to the two other sick ones. He shared his water rations to help with their dehydration. When he opened his emergency food supply, several cubs crawled over to investigate. The food bars were designed for human nutrition, but they smelled good. Jake broke one into small pieces and offered them to the cubs. They ate hungrily. It was clear they had not had enough food in days. Your cubs are starving, Jake said gently. When did they last eat a full meal? Shen's ears drooped with shame. The storm has lasted many days. Our hunters cannot leave the cave. Our stored food is almost gone. Jake divided his remaining food bars among all the cubs. It was not much, but it was something. Tomorrow he would need to find more food. For now, keeping the cubs alive was more important than his own hunger. As the hours passed, Jake's actions began to change the atmosphere in the chamber. The cubs were warmer and breathing easier. The warriors were still suspicious, but they were no longer actively threatening him. Jake curled up on the cold stone floor and tried to sleep. He gave his blanket to the cubs and used his empty pack as a pillow. The ground was hard and uncomfortable, but at least he was alive. In the middle of the night, Jake woke to find one of the smallest cubs sleeping against his side. The little creature had crawled away from the warmth of the heater to curl up with the strange outsider who had brought medicine and food. Gorthak saw this too. The pack leader's expression was unreadable as he watched his youngest cub trust the human completely. Jake went back to sleep with a small smile. He was still surrounded by creatures who could kill him in seconds, but for the first time since entering the cave, he felt hope. Tomorrow he would start building something better for these cubs. Tomorrow he would show these people that not all outsiders came to destroy. Jake woke to find 3 cubs sleeping against him. The smallest one was breathing much easier. The antibiotics were working. The little creature's fur was dry and warm instead of cold and damp. The storm was still raging outside. Jake could hear wind howling through the cave entrance. But inside the chamber, his portable heater had made a real difference. The cubs were no longer shivering. Gorthak and his warriors were awake too. They watched Jake carefully as he checked each cub's condition. The sickest one was definitely improving. Its breathing was clear and its nose was dry. The other 2 were also getting better. The medicine works, Shen observed. Their fever is gone. Jake nodded and packed away his medical scanner. They will recover, but they will get sick again if this cave stays cold and wet. He stood up and walked to one of the worst water leaks. Cold water dripped steadily from a crack in the ceiling, creating a puddle that never dried. Jake pulled out a tube of emergency sealant from his pack. This will stop the water, he said, showing the tube to Shen. It becomes hard like rock when it dries. Jake squeezed sealant into the crack. The dripping stopped immediately. He moved to the next leak and sealed it too. Within an hour, he had stopped all the major water leaks in the chamber. Nethys watched everything Jake did. The young warrior was fascinated by the human tools and techniques. When Jake started working on airflow, Nethys began asking questions. Why do you make holes in the wall? Nethys asked through the translator. Air needs to move, Jake explained. Bad air goes out. Good air comes in. Cubs breathe better. Jake was using a small cutting tool to create ventilation channels near the ceiling. The work was slow and careful. He did not want to weaken the cave structure. Gorthak finally spoke up. Why do you help our cubs? What do you gain? Jake stopped working and turned to face the pack leader. This was the question he had been expecting. In truth, he was not sure how to answer it. On my world, we believe cubs should be protected, Jake said. All cubs. Even cubs that are not ours. It is just right. Gorthak's scarred face showed confusion. You have no cubs of your own here. These cubs will not help you. Why care if they live or die? Jake thought about this. How could he explain human empathy to creatures who had never experienced kindness from outsiders? Because they are young and helpless, Jake said finally. Because they hurt and I can help them. That is enough reason. Shen moved closer to the conversation. Tell us about your people, she said. Are all humans like you? Jake smiled sadly. No, some humans are kind. Some are cruel. Some care about cubs. Some care only about themselves. We are not all the same. But you are the kind that cares, Shen said. It was not a question. Yes, Jake said. I am that kind. As the day went on, Jake continued improving the cave. He used pieces of his broken equipment to create better insulation. He built a simple drainage system using rocks and metal strips. He even constructed a small chimney to help the heater work more efficiently. Nethys helped with the heavy work. The young warrior was strong and eager to learn. Jake taught him about leverage and structural support. Nethys taught Jake about the local rock types and which ones were strong or weak. You are a good student, Jake told Nethys. You understand building quickly, Nethys preened at the praise. My pack says I think too much about new things. They say I should follow old ways. Old ways are good when they work, Jake said. New ways are good when old ways fail. Smart people use both. The cubs were getting stronger by the hour. They played together near the heater, wrestling and tumbling like healthy babies should. Their fur was clean and fluffy now that they were warm and dry. Jake shared his remaining food with them again. He was getting hungry himself, but seeing the cubs eat was worth it. Shen noticed his sacrifice. You give your food to our young, she said. Do you not need to eat? I need to eat, Jake admitted. But cubs need food more than adults. They are growing. That evening, Nethys returned from a quick hunting trip with fresh meat. He offered some to Jake, who accepted gratefully. It was the first time any of the warriors had shared their food with him. As they ate together, Shen told Jake about her people's history. The Vorthak had once been a peaceful race. They traded with other species and welcomed visitors to their world. But 50 years ago, slave traders had come to their planet. The traders had pretended to be scientists at first. They had seemed friendly and harmless. Then they had attacked the nursery caves and stolen hundreds of Vorthak cubs. We never saw our children again, Shen said. The traders sold them to fighting pits on distant worlds. Made them into weapons and entertainment. Jake felt sick. He understood now why the Vorthak were so suspicious of outsiders, why they had nearly killed him on sight. They had learned to expect the worst from other species. Not all outsiders are like those traders, Jake said gently. We know that now, Shen replied. You have shown us. That night Jake slept better. The cubs were healthy and warm. The cave was dry and well ventilated. Nethys had even helped him build a proper sleeping area with soft materials. But in the middle of the night, Nethys shook Jake awake. The young warrior looked frightened. Our scouts have returned, Nethys whispered. There is bad news. Jake sat up quickly. What kind of bad news? A ship has landed near the southern cliffs, Nethys said. Armed outsiders. They carry cages and weapons. They ask questions about Vorthak nurseries. Jake's blood turned cold. Slave traders? We think so, Nethys said. And they are moving this way. Across the chamber, Gorthak was already gathering his warriors. They spoke in urgent whispers, making plans. Jake could guess what those plans were. The pack would scatter. They would abandon the cave and try to hide their cubs in the wilderness until the traders left. It was a desperate plan. The cubs were still weak. The storm was still raging. Many would die from exposure before the traders even found them. Jake stood up and walked over to Gorthak. I have a different idea, he said. The pack leader looked at him with surprise. You would help us fight? I would help you win, Jake said. Jake spread his equipment across the cave floor. He had emergency flares, a cutting tool, spare power cells, and various electronic devices. Not much for fighting armed slave traders, but enough for what he had in mind. How many traders? Jake asked. Our scout counted 8, Gorthak replied. They carry energy weapons and stunning devices. They have armor and shields, Jake nodded. 8 armed professionals against a pack of 6 warriors. In a straight fight, the Vorthak would lose. But Jake was not thinking about a straight fight. Do they know about this cave? Jake asked. Not yet, Shen said. But they are searching. They will find us within 2 days. Good, Jake said. That gives us time to prepare. Gorthak's scarred face showed confusion. Prepare for what? We cannot fight them here. We must take the cubs and run. Running will not work, Jake said firmly. The cubs are still weak. The storm will kill them, and the traitors will track you anyway. Jake pulled out his tablet and began sketching on the screen. But this cave can become a fortress. We can make it impossible for them to take the cubs. Nethys leaned over Jake's shoulder, interested. How? Jake pointed to his rough drawing. The cave has only one entrance. That is good for defense. We can create choke points here and here, force them to come at us in small groups. They have better weapons, Gorthak protested. Yes, but weapons need clear shots, Jake said. We can build barriers, create blind corners, make them fight on our terms instead of theirs. Jake stood up and walked to the cave entrance. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people. Perfect for what he had in mind. We will build multiple defense lines, Jake explained. First line will slow them down and separate them. Second line will be the real fight. Third line will protect the cubs if everything else fails. Over the next day and a half, Jake worked with desperate energy. He used his cutting tool to create fighting positions in the cave walls. He built barriers from loose rocks and pieces of his equipment. He created multiple fallback positions throughout the tunnel system. Nethys worked beside him, learning human military tactics with surprising speed. The young warrior understood the concepts of crossfire, cover, and concentrated force. Together they turned the cave into a maze of deadly surprises. Your people are good at war, Nethys observed as they set up the third barrier. Too good, Jake said sadly. Humans have been fighting each other for thousands of years. We have learned many hard lessons. Jake rigged his emergency flares as improvised explosives. He set up motion sensors to give early warning. He even created fake tunnels to confuse the attackers. Every advantage he could think of he built into their defenses. Gorthak remained skeptical until Jake demonstrated the first trap. A simple tripwire released a cascade of rocks that would crush anyone coming through the tunnel. The pack leader's eyes widened with understanding. You fight like Vorthak, Gorthak said with approval. You think like prey that has become predator. I fight like someone who wants to protect cubs, Jake replied. As they worked, Jake learned more about Vorthak culture. Their society was built around the pack and the protection of young. Adults were expected to die before allowing cubs to be harmed. It was their most sacred duty. That is why we cannot understand you, Shen told Jake. You are not Vorthak. These cubs are not your blood, yet you risk everything for them. Maybe that is what makes humans special, Jake said. We can care about cubs that are not ours. We can make family from strangers. On the morning of the second day, the scouts reported that the traitors were getting close. They had found tracks leading toward the cave system. Jake made final adjustments to his defenses and gathered the pack for last instructions. Remember, Jake said, let them come deep into the tunnels before we spring the first trap. Separate them. Make them fight in small groups. Use your claws and teeth up close where their energy weapons are less effective. The warriors nodded grimly. They had practiced the plan dozens of times. They knew their positions and roles. Jake sealed the cubs in the deepest chamber with Shen standing guard. If somehow the traitors got past all the defenses, the old female would make a final stand to protect the young ones. You should stay with the cubs too, Gorthak told Jake. You are not a warrior. Jake checked his improvised weapons one last time. Today I am whatever the cubs need me to be. The first motion sensor triggered at midday. 8 figures in combat armor were approaching the cave entrance. They moved professionally, covering each other and checking for threats. Jake watched them through his hidden cameras. The leader was tall and reptilian with cold yellow eyes. Vex Korath, probably. The infamous Zephyrian slaver who specialized in capturing young aliens. The traitors paused at the cave mouth, scanning with energy detectors. They would spot the first obvious traps easily. But Jake had counted on that. The obvious traps were just to make them overconfident. Primitive defenses. Korath hissed to his team. Disarm the rocks and advance. 2 of the traitors disabled Jake's rock trap and moved into the tunnel. They were being careful but not careful enough. They did not know about the hidden pressure plates Jake had installed. The first traitor stepped on the concealed trigger. Jake's improvised explosive went off, collapsing part of the tunnel roof. Both traitors were buried under tons of rock. Now there were 6. Korath's angry roar echoed through the caves. Spread out. Watch for more traps. Find those cubs. But the tunnel system forced them to stay together. Jake had chosen the battlefield well. The traitors had to come at the defenders in single file. giving up their advantages in numbers and firepower. The real battle was about to begin. Jake crouched in his fighting position, holding his cutting tool like a weapon. His heart pounded with fear and adrenaline. He had never been in combat before, but somewhere behind him, 6 small cubs were depending on him to keep them safe. That was all the courage Jake needed. The battle erupted in the narrow tunnel with violence that shook the cave walls. Korath's remaining team advanced more carefully now, but Jake's defenses forced them into a deadly game of cat and mouse. The second defense line was where Jake had positioned Nethys and 2 other warriors. When the traitors rounded the corner, they walked into a storm of claws and fury. The Vorthak fought with the desperate strength of parents protecting their young. Energy blasts lit up the tunnel walls, but the close quarters made the traitors' weapons less effective. A Vorthak warrior could cross the distance and strike before an energy rifle could track and fire. Jake watched through his cameras as Nethys took down a traitor twice his size with pure speed and determination, but the traitors were professionals. They adapted quickly to the close quarters fighting. 2 more Vorthak warriors fell to energy blasts before the remaining defenders had to fall back to the 3rd position. Now it was just Gorthak, Nethys and Jake holding the final line before the Cubs' chamber. Korath himself led the assault on the 3rd barrier. The reptilian slaver moved with deadly grace, his energy weapon carving through rock and metal alike. 3 traitors followed him, their armor scorched but intact. "Give us the Cubs and we will let you live," Korath called out in universal standard. "Resist further and you all die." Gorthak's response was a roar that echoed through the caves. The pack leader charged forward with his claws extended, drawing enemy fire away from his companions. Jake watched in amazement as the scarred warrior fought 4 enemies at once, giving ground slowly but making each step cost the traitors dearly. Jake triggered his final trap. Emergency flares burst like tiny suns, filling the tunnel with blinding light and choking smoke. In the confusion, Nethys struck like a shadow, his black fur making him nearly invisible in the chaos. But there were still too many enemies. Jake saw Gorthak stumble as an energy blast caught him in the shoulder. Nethys was pinned down behind failing cover. The traitors were going to break through. That was when Jake did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He stepped out of cover and walked toward the enemy. Jake had no armor, no powerful weapons, no claws or fangs. He was just a human scientist with a cutting tool and an idea, but sometimes an idea was the most dangerous weapon of all. "Korath!" Jake shouted. "I know who you are. Vex Korath, wanted by the Galactic Council for slave trading. Bounty of 5 million credits. The reptilian slaver turned his cold yellow eyes toward Jake. "So, you plan to collect it, little human?" "No," Jake said calmly, "but I already sent a message to the Council fleet. They will be here in 6 hours. You can take these cubs and run, but you will never make it off planet." Korath laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You lie. There is no communication from this cave." Jake held up his tablet showing a transmission log. "Emergency beacon. Activated when your ship landed. Standard xenobiologist protocol when encountering hostile forces." It was a complete bluff. Jake's communications had been dead since the storm started. But his tablet's display looked convincing, and Korath had no way to verify the truth. The slaver's expression changed from confidence to uncertainty. "Show me the transmission." Jake tossed the tablet to Korath, who caught it and began reading. While the reptilian was distracted, Jake gave Nethys a hand signal they had practiced. The young warrior understood immediately. Nethys moved like liquid darkness. His claws found the throat of the traitor nearest to Korath. Gorthak, despite his wound, struck down another enemy. Suddenly the odds were much better. Korath realized the deception too late. Jake's tablet contained nothing but geological surveys and cub health records. But the moment of distraction had cost the slaver his advantage. The final traitor tried to run, but Jake's cutting tool sliced through the power pack of his armor. The man fell hard and did not get up. Korath faced 3 enemies with no backup and a dwindling power supply. The reptilian slaver was dangerous, but he was not stupid. He knew when a situation had turned hopeless. "This is not over, human," Korath hissed. "I will return with more ships. More warriors. Maybe," Jake said, "but not today. And not for these cubs." Korath retreated through the tunnels, abandoning his team and his mission. Jake let him go. Dead martyrs sometimes became symbols. Live cowards usually just disappeared. In the aftermath of the battle, Jake worked frantically to treat the wounded. Gorthak's shoulder needed surgery that Jake was not qualified to perform, but he could stop the bleeding and fight infection. Nethys had taken a glancing energy blast to his leg but would recover fully. The cubs were safe. All 6 were healthy and frightened but unharmed. They clung to Shen in the deep chamber, not understanding why the adults had been fighting but knowing instinctively that they had been protected. That evening, as Jake finished treating Gorthak's wounds, the pack leader spoke quietly. "You fought for cubs that are not yours," Gorthak said. "You bled for young that share no blood with you. I do not understand this, but I honor it." Jake smiled tiredly. "Maybe understanding is not important. Maybe actions are enough." Shen approached with something in her hands. It was a carved stone pendant, worn smooth by generations of handling. The design showed adult wolves surrounding cubs, protecting them from all sides. "This belonged to my grandmother," Shen said, "and her grandmother before that. It is given only to those who prove they are true guardians of the young." She placed the pendant around Jake's neck. "You are pack now. These cubs are your cubs. This cave is your cave. You are Vorthak in all ways that matter." Nethys stepped forward next. "Will you stay? Will you teach us more about building and fighting? There may be other traders." Jake looked around the cave that had become his home. The cubs were playing together, healthy and safe. The chamber was warm and dry, improved by human engineering and Vorthak determination. The pack had accepted him as family. "Yes," Jake said, "I will stay. I will teach you what I know, and you will teach me what you know. Together we will make sure no one ever threatens these cubs again." Gorthak nodded with approval. "The pack is stronger with you in it." Over the following months, Jake helped build defenses for other Vorthak settlements. He taught them human military tactics and construction techniques. In return, they taught him about their culture, their history, and their deep commitment to protecting the innocent. The story of the human who fought for alien cubs spread throughout the galaxy. It became a symbol of what was possible when different species chose cooperation over conflict. When beings chose to see similarities instead of differences, Jake never returned to Earth. The pack was his family now. The cubs he had saved grew up calling him Uncle Jake. They learned both human and Vorthak ways of building and fighting and protecting. And in the deepest chamber of the cave, where 6 small cubs had once been dying, Jake built a school. Vorthak and human children learned together, preparing for a future where species worked together instead of apart. The pendant around Jake's neck had belonged to many guardians over the years. Now it would pass to a new generation. To cubs who had learned that family was not about blood or species. Family was about who you chose to protect.